Every single costing here says assumed existing building. You can go right through the whole thing. It says assumed existing building. Everything. So the executive summary of this report says, I can read it all if you want me to bore you, but the executive summary says that the Joint Strike Force fighter is going to have very, very little impact, noise-wise. So much so that they're not recommending any insulation at all for any existing dwellings in any zone. So there are no recommendations. They said it's going to have very little impact and it's just business as usual, folks. That's the executive summary. Let's just push this report and get it out. They only forgot one thing. And I rang council up this morning and I said, have you guys noticed just one thing? They've recommended that there be no attenuation, no acoustic noise. They've left out one thing: building, development, DAs, vacant land. And it's a 193-page report, and they said, yes, we spoke to the Defence about that. It seems they forgot to put it in. They forgot to put it in that in Port Stephens, in this area here, up until the year 2025, in the perimeter surrounding here, there's apparently going to be no building development because they've forgot to factor those costs in. They've forgot to give us any guidelines, you know. So all I want to say is, I was told by the Defence Department, and this says it's a draft, and I was told that this is just also a draft, and this can be altered. So what we're talking about is really nothing, right? Council told me this morning it's LAW law. It's been signed off. They are going by this map. It's law. They are going by this.
On your map here, what worries me? Hold that point. Yep. This is the old ANEF, and there was a massive hook over to Nelbra Bay. For some reason that's disappeared, but they've done a lot more fill in the other areas. There's two things. Number one, that doesn't even come into operation in 2016, the first one.
That'll be in the US, probably here not till after 2018,
2018. So it's still 8 or 9 years away. We were still in government when we started on the Joint Strike Fighter, and they're actually supposed to have been an aircraft where they could do most of their training in a simulator without the need to go to the Soldash weapons range. And in fact, in the first set of questions I asked on it, I was told there'd actually be very little use on the weapons range for the JSF. And then after Bev Mail came to see me and we asked a whole series of questions off this map, all of a sudden there's going to be an awful lot of flying at the Soldash weapons range. I can't say to you one way or the other because I don't think anybody clearly knows. Those noise maps are forecasts. They don't represent decibel ratings. 20 to 35 means absolutely nothing if you're looking at how much noise consistently over a day. You might get one jet come through that has got a certain noise level at a certain height once a week, and then that fits into a profile. But it's not about maximum noise. It's a weird computer model that nobody's ever been able to explain to me in any detail at all.
Because it's classified.
Right. They seem to be able to do ANF forecasts for commercial airlines, which works out exactly the same sort of thing. So
it's not a defence model.
And it's not Defence that actually model the ANFs, correct?
Standards, Australia.
No, there's a special group who internationally do noise forecasts based off computer models and tracks and GPS tracks and all that sort of stuff. But I am still yet to fathom out how some areas which are 25 to 30 very rarely ever hear an aeroplane. In other areas like downtown Raymond Terrace, which is supposed to be under 10 to 15, the planes are so loud over my office sometimes we can't even answer the phone. So I don't know. I've got a lot more questions I want to ask Defence on this. I've just come back from Canberra. I was with Angus Houston, the Chief of Defence Force, this afternoon on another matter, and I've arranged to have some chats to him about them. But I can't understand why the flight profile has changed so dramatically, given that the hook on there I think was for the lead-in fighter, because it came down under the forecast for the lead-in fighter. That's now disappeared, and yet the lead-in fighter is going to stay here in continuum. So I don't know. There are a lot of questions to be answered. it comes into three series of arguments. There's the noise from the airport itself, and that's got some issues at the moment because you've got council wanting to push and approve all the Kings Hill development directly under a flight path, and the people who buy blocks landing are in exactly the same position that you are now. That's one of the issues. The second issue is you've got people living adjoining directly to the range who live under incredible noise pressures, and we've been trying to get the government to offer voluntary, I don't believe in compulsory acquisition, voluntary acquisition of those properties to remove them from the area. And then the third issue is these changing noise profiles where you disadvantage people so many years into the future before it even occurs without an appellable right, and I think that's wrong too. So I've come to listen tonight and hear what you say, but there's questions I want to ask in Canberra about.
Well, just before you sit down, we're dealing with this next fighter.
Yes.
What about the next one after that?
Well,
are they going to lose?
You'll be dead
you'll
You'll
at least be deaf by then. Can I say to you then?
Are we going to be in the same?
Well, I mean,
going through the same argument again?
Going back to when I was on council and before that, I always found it hard to fathom from these expert planners that plan our communities how they were never unable to understand about years ago, before when a lot of this stuff around here was all farmland. They didn't quarantine areas around weapons ranges or on flight approaches, because what they're trying to do is actually build houses in the middle of freeways, right? And there's one thing that's for sure, and that's aircraft get noisier and military aircraft get noisier and noisier and noisier. The Joint Strike Fighter, according to my brief in defence, is supposed to be less noisy on takeoff because it's a more powerful aircraft, has more thrust, therefore it doesn't need to go to full strength to take up. That's at the airport, but what you've got here is a different situation where it's doing what they call pop runs, where it dives in, backs off, dives in, and then powers up out of it, where it goes on to pretty much full thrust. It's a totally different kettle of fish. I don't know, the noise contours, I don't know, I'm still trying to get answers. We quizzed Fitzgibbon about them when he was Defence Minister, and we got a really obscure set of explanations which contradicted the statements he'd made in the papers about 2 weeks earlier. So,
well, is this whole thing really about the firing range? If that wasn't...
All you're affected here by is the firing range.
Yeah, so if it wasn't there,
yes,
we wouldn't have this trouble.
If it wasn't there, neither would Williamtown Ref Base.
Well, they can't put that somewhere else?
They actually have shifted a lot of training, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Mike, into other areas like Evans Head and offshore. Yep. But because Williamtown is set up to do first entry into fast jets with the Hawk lead-in fighter, and then they progress through to the F-18s as we have now, and eventually, if indeed we end up with the Joint Strike Fighters, that's their progressive model. Williamtown is a training base, and without the core nexus of it being a training base...
So how close does the firing range have to be to the base?
Well, it can be a long way away, but back when we were in government, I had Brendan Nelson, who was fairly sympathetic. He's the guy who got all the land board out around the end of the airport, Steele Street, Moxie. They did a study into where they could relocate the range to, and they're talking well out west of sort of Burke or Warren, somewhere out there, to have the same area, so they're not just transferring it from one group to another. But then they put the argument, well, you know, our flight time costs so much per hour times the number of flights, it'd be cheaper to pack the whole base up and move the whole base to a new area. So I've gone down these arguments over the past, 14 years.
I mean, really where it all is tying up so much property and so much of the area development-wise, isn't it?
Well, but had councils going back many years ago worked out that, you know, aircraft are going to get bigger, noisier, and actually designated over what was all just rural farmland and bushland at the time, no development zones, you wouldn't have any of the problems you've got now, because you wouldn't have bought blocks of land because they would never have been approved.